In this Flutter app, I am using icon buttons to increase and decrease the number of passengers, open a full screen dialog and close the full screen dialog. Let's code this app from scratch. We start off with a blank VS Code window. I'll go ahead and open the folder I have created specifically for this project. Next, I'll open up the terminal and use the command flutter create demo_app to create a new project in a folder called demo_app. As we can see, our project has been created. I have also added this .vs code folder with this settings.json file, mostly to keep the IntelliSense pop-ups from showing up as I write the code. Let's now go to the main.dat file to write our code. I'll start by setting Chrome as the device so that we are able to run this app on the browser. Next, I'll change the title of this app, remove the comments in this code, and remove some of this code so that we remain with only a blank scaffold. At the top here, I will create two variables, an integer called number of passengers that we will initialize as 0, and a string called flight information that talks about the number of available flights daily as well as the food and drink served on the flight. Next, I will set the background color of the scaffold to amber with a shade of 200, and inside the body of the scaffold, I will have a centered card with an all-round margin of 20 pixels, and the child of this card will be a column whose main axis alignment will be set to center. At the top of this column, we will have a text widget that says flight to the Mara with a text style that sets its font size to 20 and its font weight to bold, followed by a sized box for spacing, then a divider with a thickness of 2, then a sized box for spacing, followed by a text widget that says set the number of passengers, then a sized box for spacing. Below this sized box, we will have a text widget whose content will be the number of passengers variable converted to a string with a text style that sets the font size to 30, followed by a sized box for spacing, and then a row for the icon buttons whose main axis alignment property will be set to center. At the start of this row, we're going to have an icon button. The icon property allows us to define the icon which will be displayed inside the icon button, and for this icon button, we're going to use the remove icon. Next, we have the onPressed property, which allows us to define a function that will be called when the icon button is pressed. If this property is null, then the icon button will be disabled. Here we will use a ternary function where if the number of passengers is greater than 0, we will have a function inside of which we will use a setState function to decrease the number of passengers by 1. Otherwise, this property will be null. That means if the number of passengers is not greater than 0, we will not be able to decrease the number of passengers. Next, we will set the disabled color property to red. That means when the number of passengers is not greater than 0, meaning this icon button is disabled, then the color of the icon will be red. After this icon button, we will have a sized box for spacing, and then the second icon button. Its icon will be the add icon. In its onPressed property, we will have a function inside of which we will use a setState function to increase the number of passengers by 1. In its color property, we will have blue, which means that the icon itself will be blue in color, and its highlight color property will be blue, which means when you click on the icon button, the circle itself will be blue in color. After this row with the icon buttons, we will have a divider with a thickness of 2 pixels, and then we'll move on to the flight info section where we will start with an align widget whose alignment will be set to top right so that it positions its child to the top right of this section. The child of this align widget will be an icon button which we will use to display the full screen flight info dialog. Its icon will be the arrow outward icon. Its onPressed property for now will be a blank function, but I will come back to this after I'm done defining the other properties of this icon button. Its splash color will be green, which means that when we click on this icon button, its color will change to green in an animated splash-like fashion. Its splash radius will be 20 pixels, which is smaller than the default splash radius of the icon button, which means that when I hover over this icon button, you'll notice that the circle around it will be smaller than that of the other icon buttons, and its tooltip will be a string that says view flight info, which means when I hover over this icon button, we will see text that says view flight info. Next, we will define the function for showing the flight info dialog at the top here, right below the variables. This function will return void, and we will call it show flight info dialog. Inside this function, we will use the show dialog function where we will define the context as context, and in its builder property, we will have a function that takes the context and returns a full screen dialog whose child will be a padding with an all-round padding of 20 pixels. The child of this padding widget will be a column whose first child will be an align widget whose alignment will be set to top right. Its child will be an icon button whose icon will be the close icon. Its onPressed property will call the navigator pop method. Its tooltip will be a string that says close flight info dialog, and its hover color will be amber with a shade of 100, which means when we hover over it, its color will be amber with a shade of 100. After this align widget, we will have a text widget that says flight info followed by a size box for spacing, and then a text widget whose content will be the flight information variable. We will call this show flight info dialog method inside our icon button for showing the full screen flight info dialog. I just noticed that this align widget as well as the divider before it are inside the row for the icon buttons instead of below the row for the icon buttons, so I'll just cut them and paste them below this row. After the align widget, we will have a text widget that says flight info followed by a sized box for spacing, and then a text widget whose content will be the flight information variable with the overflow property set to text overflow.ellipsis so that we get 3 dots when the text is too much for the available space. We are done writing this code. Let's run this app so that we can check out what it looks like as well as how the icon buttons respond in practice. Our app has now been built. I'll close this inspector tab, close this debug console, and zoom in on our app window. We can see that the icon button for reducing the number of passengers is red because the number of passengers is 0, but it becomes active as soon as the number of passengers increases beyond 0. The icon button for increasing the number of passengers has a blue icon and the entire circle turns blue when we click on it. The icon button for showing the full screen flight info dialog has a smaller radius than the other icon buttons, and it turns green in an animated splash manner when we click on it. The icon button for closing the full screen flight info dialog turns amber with a shade of 100 when we hover over it and has a tooltip that says close flight info dialog. And that's how you set up the icon button in Flutter. If you have enjoyed this video and found value in it, be sure to give it a thumbs up and share it with someone who might find it useful as well. And if you haven't already, subscribe to this channel with the notifications turned on so that you get notified every time I upload a new video.